Turning back to politics on this side of the border, the federal government has a big decision to make, and it strikes at the heart of one of the most divisive debates in this country. A proposed $20 billion oil sands mine in northern Alberta is awaiting Ottawa's approval. It would be one of the largest oil mines ever developed in Alberta, about half the size of Edmonton. The company Teck Resources wants to build the Frontier Mine north of Fort McMurray. It would produce 260,000 barrels of bitumen a day and create, the company says, 10,000 jobs. Overall, the company estimates the mine will emit 4.1 megatons of carbon dioxide a year over its 4 decades in operation. So if Canada is trying to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, why should the feds approve this? Jason Nixon is Alberta's Environment Minister. He joins us from the legislature in Edmonton. Hi, Minister. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Minister, I'm going to start with that very question because I looked through the Joint Review Panel's decision and ultimately it did decide that this project was in the public interest, in the national interest. But at the same time, it cited the fact that the project, and I want to get the wording right, if it is approved and constructed, may make it more difficult to achieve Canada's targets and commitments under the Paris Accord. Given the weight, the significance that the federal government has placed on meeting those targets and actually even exceeding them, why would it be in their interest to approve this project?
Well, it's actually not, quite frankly, what's in the interest of the Trudeau government. It's what's in the interest of Albertans and Canadians. And the end result of that project assessment was to make clear that it was in the best interest of the public. It is a project that will create a significant amount of jobs and economic prosperity for both the province of Alberta and our country. And it did identify environmental impacts that would have to be mitigated in order to be able to proceed with the project. And the point that comes down to this, Teck and the province of Alberta have been able to mitigate those environmental concerns. And if you can't approve this project, it means that the federal government's not going to approve any project. This project, again, has met every hurdle, followed every rule, and has been made very, very clear that it's in the public interest, and this is a project that should go forward.
Actually, not all the mitigation convinced the Joint Review Panel. For example, it said, we agree the evidence provided by Teck does not show how the Frontier project will achieve best-in-class greenhouse gas emissions intensity. That was a claim made by Teck and supported by the government of Alberta, that this would be really evolved technology and that it would be low intensity. The Joint Review Panel said, for example, it agreed with people who were against that and said that the evidence that put forward by Teck didn't support that. So again, I take your point on it being in the national interest, but I think a lot of Canadians would argue meeting those targets is also in the national interest.
Well, again, we have made commitments here within our province to be able to meet our environmental obligations around emissions. In this case, Teck would fall underneath our large emitter program inside the province, the TIER program, which I brought through the legislature just a few months ago. So we are moving forward to be able to mitigate and fulfill our responsibilities around climate change, and Teck would fall within what the province of Alberta is already doing on that important issue. So for the feds to come in now and all of a sudden say that the rules change, I will remind you, Minister Wilkinson provided equivalency for our large emitter program, which the Teck Frontier Mine falls under. So the idea now that you change your mind or change the rules or continue to ask for more is something that Albertans fundamentally reject. This is a project, again, where environmental impacts have been overcome, not just on emissions, but there have been on caribou habitat, bison habitat, water issues that the company has worked hard on, as has the province of Alberta. It is in the best interest of the public, and if you can't approve this project, what it means is you can't approve any project, which is something our province just will not accept.
But what you're arguing is that this project will fall under the carbon tax that your government put forward, that yes, the federal government said was approved and said meets its standards. But there's another standard the federal government has set, and that is around a carbon tax applied on the consumption side of things. What Minister Wilkinson seems to be implying is, and I'm not saying this is verbatim, but what he seems to be implying is they would be more willing to approve something like this if your government would apply a carbon tax on the consumption side of things. Is that something your government is willing to do?
No, our government is not willing to bring in a consumer carbon tax. We are committed to fulfilling our obligations when it comes to climate change here in the province of Alberta, but we are also committed to not doing that on the back of hardworking Alberta families. Alberta has a different approach. We're focused on technology. We're focused on working with our largest emitters, including Teck, if they were fortunate enough to be able to bring forward the Frontier Mine. That's our approach. That's the difference, a disagreement between us and the federal government. But I would also remind you, the federal government has a consumption tax, carbon tax on the province of Alberta. So I'm not really sure if I follow Minister Wilkinson's point. If he's already brought forward that tax on our province, Does he want us to increase the tax and bring in a second tax? I mean, this is the point. He's changing the rules in the middle of it. Further to that, the feds have indicated that they wanted to at times see us have an emission cap inside the province of Alberta on oil sands, something our province has indicated that we're willing to do. So at this point, what the biggest problem is the feds keep changing the game, keep changing the rules in the middle of the game. The reality is that this went through a regulatory process. It's been approved in the best interests of the province, and it should move forward.
Yeah, but I take your point on that. That's not necessarily the rules as they were outlined initially. But let's say, for the sake of this project, if simply imposing a provincial carbon tax on consumers in your province would get it approved, if in fact it is going to have the economic impact that you say that it will, why would you not consider that?
The main reason being is because Albertans fundamentally rejected having a carbon tax put on them by the Alberta government. They overwhelmingly voted for it this past April to be removed. Our government fulfilled that campaign promise. We reject the government having a right to be able to impose a carbon tax on our citizens. We'll continue to fight that in court and at the ballot box as we've promised Alberta. And so no, we're not going to be held hostage by the federal government. This project has went through a regulatory process. The Prime Minister has reached out to our province and said that he wanted to work with us and provide unity within Confederation. We've been clear that this is one of the things that has to be accomplished to be able to achieve that. And so now it's time for the Prime Minister to show whether he was serious or not and approve a project that has went through the regulatory process, that's in the best interest of this province and this country, that will create jobs and is in a great spot to be able to move forward. This is a good opportunity for Justin Trudeau to show that he truly wants to work with Albertans.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Minister Nixon. Appreciate your time this evening.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
Jason Nixon, Minister of the Environment in Alberta.
This project has gone through all the approvals, and now there are signals that the Prime Minister is waffling on it. Will he show Canadians that he believes in Canada's energy sector, side with those who have lost their jobs, not with the activists and celebrities?
The Conservatives railing against activists, celebrities, or ordinary Canadians with concerns did not help the energy sector. What has helped the energy sector is a responsible approach that recognizes environmental stewardship, partnership with Indigenous peoples, and moving forward in a thoughtful way towards a lower carbon future is the right path for Canadians.
The project that Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is referring to there is the massive Teck Frontier oil sands project in northeastern Alberta. The project is pegged at a value of $20.6 billion. Federal Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson has suggested that while Cabinet makes a decision on the project, Alberta's climate plan could factor into that decision ultimately. We're back with the Power Panel. Tracy Ramsey, Amanda Alvaro, Melissa Lantzman, Danielle Turp, and Chris Hall. Chris, I'm going to start with you because this is a big deal. The deadline is the end of February. Cabinet can say yes or no. They can also extend the decision. But Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, has really framed this kind of as a litmus test of the goodwill of Ottawa towards Alberta.
Right. He's framed it as it's going to be a final slap in the face for Alberta if they say no to this project because it has gone through the regulatory approvals. He's talked about it in terms of all the First Nations bands who are in favor of this project and the economic opportunity it presents as being a part of the reconciliation process, and it shouldn't be just those voices against it that are to be heard. But in the long run, it really is a difficult battle inside the Liberal cabinet because on one hand, you have the commitment to make this country carbon neutral by 2050. You've talked about environmentalists and the support that they have from that community for trying to cut down on emissions. This project will generate a lot of emissions, yet the economic value is undeniable for Albertans. So it's a very, very difficult choice for Jonathan Wilkinson and the cabinet to make.
Yeah, Danielle, let's talk about the politics here a bit of this choice. Exactly what Chris laid out. I mean, the Joint Review Panel, which ultimately decided this was in the national interest, also cited the fact that it would impede or make more difficult Canada's ability to reach the targets that it had set out at the time, which, by the way, weren't even as aggressive as the targets the Liberals set out during the campaign. How difficult a decision will this be for Cabinet, do you think?
Very difficult. And I don't know how they can win, because if they approve, they lose the support of all kinds of people all over the country, in the West, in Quebec. If they don't approve it, then you have Alberta, you have Jason Kenney, that are really very upset about this. And Mr. Kenney's putting so much pressure right now on Justin Trudeau that we feel the pressure now. So it's like a lose-lose situation for Justin Trudeau. And at the end, we'll see what's more important for him, is that incredible increase of emissions this project will generate, or is it trying to have Alberta or satisfy Alberta and Western Canada because it was approved because of the national interest and the interest of Western Canada?
If you were to bet, Tracy, which way do you think that Cabinet would lean on that very question?
This is very tough. I mean, this really is the question. And, you know, Jason Kenney's also framing this as Canadian unity versus the environment, and no one wins in that scenario. I mean, we're talking about a project that's twice the size of the city of Vancouver. We're talking about, you know, even today the CEO came out of this project and said they're not even sure if it receives approval that they'll go forward because of, you know, what's happening. Yeah. So, I mean, we're really at a pivotal moment right now on whether or not we're serious about climate change and pursuing goals. This project will continue into the 2060s with significant greenhouse gas emissions. This project really is, you know, very critical to determining where we go in the future. And the Liberals will signal that. They will either signal that they're going down the path of, you know, pursuing the environmental targets that we all know we have to reach, or they're going to say we're going to go down this economic path and commit to a future where Canada's tied to the oil sands well beyond 40 years from now.
Amanda, I can just picture, you know, the way in which that plays. So they obviously have a huge political constituency that wants them to act more aggressively on environmental targets, but they also have this entire story after the election of how they were shut out from Alberta and Saskatchewan, how they've tried to make, or they've at least said that they're making, and you've seen that through Chrystia Freeland, unity in this country, you know, a primary, you know, or a primary point of importance for them. So what do?
Yeah, and then you have sort of this foe in the West. You know, you have Premier Kenney, Jason Kenney, who does a good job of his kind of rhetoric-laced rah-rah, which is less about talking about the merits of the project and more about, you know, this is a litmus test for unity. So he raises the stakes every time he speaks.
But isn't that good politics?
It is good politics, but it presents a very big challenge to the government, as we've all discussed. I think what the government did well, I think it was yesterday, was when Minister Wilkinson did say, you know, part of this approval could be based on how the province, how Alberta helps the country meet its climate goals, helps the country meet its climate targets. Jason Kenney knows that you can turn a lose-lose into a win-win if he would come to the table on that part. He's not willing to do that because it is political for him, but the government needs to do just as good a job of turning up their rhetoric to get people to listen to that side of the argument.
That's an interesting point, Melissa, and that is sort of what we heard from Minister Wilkinson. Almost like, okay, if you bring in a carbon tax, and I'm interpreting this was not explicitly said, but if you bring in a carbon tax in Alberta, something that Jason Kenney was the first thing he repealed when he got in, then maybe we can consider moving forward with it.
And it's something that the Albertans have clearly said no to. So that's, you know, that's Jason Kenney's prerogative as a majority premier. But this is actually much bigger, and this is absolutely a masterclass in politics in setting the narrative and getting in front of the issue by Premier Kenney, and I would expect nothing less. But this is bigger than that, and it signals. It is what it signals for Canada. Is this a stable place for international investment or not? And this decision rides on that, because you better believe that a $20 billion project well into the 2060s is going to tell the rest of the world either you invest in Canada or you don't, and that's why it makes it an even bigger decision for Liberal cabinet.
What do they do? Let me just quickly follow up with you, Melissa. What do they do if they approve it and then the company decides they're not going ahead with it? They've spent all that political capital for...
They may do that, and that's absolutely something I think that the Liberals are probably weighing at the cabinet table. But at the end of the day, there's more than just the environmental discussion or the West discussion, and that's the global discussion of you know, what kind of Canada do we want, and does anybody want to invest here, given the uncertainty around resource projects that we've seen over the last number of years.
Just very quickly, I think this may be the most important decision the government makes in this particular session or this term, largely because of the competing interests, the environmental concerns and the commitments they've made on the world stage there. And as Melissa says, the kind of commitments they're going to make, whether Canada is open to continue in extractive industries. And then there's a national unity question. We know, we heard on the Current this morning on CBC Radio, feelings are running really deep in Western Canada, Alberta, I should say Alberta, about this project and about what signals it sends about the future of the province in Confederation.
Let me just follow up with you quickly. What do you think happens if they delay the decision? because that's an option
then
available.
they put off the inevitable. People will see right through it and write about the fact that they can't make a decision because it is so difficult. That would be my initial.
That's your headline. Is that
that's my headline.
Yeah.
I'm putting off the inevitable here. They have to make a decision, obviously, at some point, and it will have huge consequences no matter what they decide.
Okay.
And don't forget the legal challenges. Don't forget the legal. This is not over. Even they make.
Well, as we've seen, an approval is not construction, right? Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.